So, welcome everybody. We're glad to have you join us. And we're really excited to talk about Glitter Up the Dark, How Pop Music Broke the Binary with author Sasha Geffen. If you have questions for Sasha, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the program. So, let me start off with introducing Sasha. Sasha is based in Colorado and their work focuses on the intersections between pop culture and gender. Sasha has appeared in Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Art Forum, The Nation, and The New Inquiry, among others. So welcome, and would you like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself, the book, and reading a favorite passage?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for having me. It's really great to beam into Fort Worth, Texas, virtually. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I wrote this book after a couple years of thinking a little bit more closely about the way that music was made by trans musicians in particular, doing, a good amount of album reviews, interviews kind of around that subject. And having that be my beat made me want to go deeper into the history of gender nonconformity, gender rebellion, and pop music, because it seemed that there was a pretty strong connection. And this was kind of an opportunity for me to look at how strong it was and in what ways those two things intersected over the past 50 or so years of pop music. Um, so that book kind of came out of that idea of like, just how deep does this thing go? And I think what I would like to do is just read a few paragraphs from chapter 1 of the book, which is about the Beatles, which is a band that obviously has, many thousands of words written about them. But something that I wanted to do in my turn at writing about the Beatles was look at the ways that they related as a band to teen girls in particular, um, and how that dynamic between, these young British men and teenage English and American girls, for the most part, um, how that offered a kind of rupture in gender dynamics between fans and performers up until that time. So I'm just going to read like 4 paragraphs at the top of this chapter. This is called Screaming the Beatles. The first boy band breaks the gender mold. The first sound to hit is the scream. It crashes in before the first chord, whips around and through the band, suspends them as they play, and chases them long after they've dropped their instruments and sauntered off the stage. The scream announces and outlives the songs, which are incidental. The girls are not screaming in response to the music. The band is playing in response to the scream. Before American viewers heard the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, they heard how the Beatles were adored. The city has never witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles, Sullivan said by way of introduction. He had welcomed Elvis Presley onto his show 8 years prior. He knew the look of a frenzy, and he could tell that this one was different from the last. What he saw then, though no one quite knew it yet, was a new genus of fandom, new in intensity, but also in the quality of its symbiosis. Without Beatles girls, there's no Beatles. Each group forged its identity in relation to the other. The religious ecstasy aroused in these women and girls can be heard not just as an accessory to the music of the Beatles, but as part of the music. It's impossible to think of the Beatles without thinking of the scream. In May 1964, the band aired a television special called Around the Beatles, in which, to avoid technical difficulties, they lip-synced and mimed along to pre-recorded tracks. The only live sound produced during the performance came from the dozens of girls who were there to scream their devotion. On Ed Sullivan, the sound dwarfs them. The 4 men bop along, singing rudimentary melodies in accented voices, barely hitting their notes. They're not much to look at except for the hair, scandalous, too long, and the delight that animates their faces when they watch the girls watching them. Paul, singing lead on All My Loving, drinks it up. Ringo beams intermittently from behind the kit. Even George, the shy one, sneaks a look at the crowd during his first solo. That's where the show happens, not in the jangly rock and roll chords they scrape out, not in the flat, breathless harmonies or the childish dance moves, but in the faces of the Beatles as they look up into the stands where the real spectacle is taking place. Oh. I realize I kind of not quite insult the Beatles, but I realize it sounds a little bit. I guess I wanted to like deflate some of the breathless enthusiasm that has followed them for the past like half century. But I say all this with fondness.
Well, and it's interesting because I've recently seen several different new documentaries about them, and one of the ones I saw recently talked about the whole reason why they stopped playing in public was because they got tired of not even actually being able to hear what they were playing, and that that they really felt like they could have just stood there and done nothing, and everybody would just be screaming, and they didn't see the point. Why are we doing this? Because it's not like they're listening to anything we're playing. They're just out there screaming. And I think it's really, that phenomenon is something I have never really been able to understand, because I've never understood why you would go to a concert or an event if you weren't actually going to listen and to what was going on the stage. And while I like the Beatles and I like many other musicians, I've never understood why people get that crazy about about all of that. And I don't know if it's just because it was such a departure from what music was before with Elvis and with them that created all of that. It's just really fascinating to me. It doesn't, it's not, I just think it's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there is a lot to be kind of examined about this phenomenon of celebrity in general, but about like musical celebrity in particular. The aura that these musicians kind of bring to these events. And what interested me when I was researching this chapter was just the way that Beatles girls kind of were able to bond with each other more than they didn't actually get to interact directly with the Beatles in any way. It was more about like sitting in the audience or standing in the audience and like basking in the aura of the knowledge that like the Beatles are 100 feet away from you physically, but then also sharing that excitement with everyone around you. I think as much as the girls are screaming for the Beatles to hear them, they're also kind of screaming for each other and having these shared bonds of identity forming, of passion around both the music that's being played and kind of the sexual appeal of the boys on stage. And I think that's something that, continues to happen in contemporary fandom, whether it's around like One Direction or K-pop bands, like the boy band construct is still very much alive, and there's all kinds of new dimensions that can come through that now that people are connected online and can have very, very strong community built around the shared experience of like loving a certain band, whether or not it has anything to do with like the particularities of the music. Because with the Beatles, like the chapter in the book really only talks about like their very early music, which is not especially original. It's just rock and roll Chuck Berry redux, basically. What's different about it is kind of the way that they approach it, which is a little bit more effeminate, maybe a little bit more ironic, and definitely, more designed to be a product than a lot of kind of first generation rock and roll was. Like the Beatles in particular were very carefully and deliberately marketed to sell lots and lots of records and other merchandise. So I think there's just like a lot of factors around like why that band was a watershed band, that have really nothing to do with the way their music sounds like necessarily, or at least not the formal qualities of their music. You know, it's not those early chord progressions necessarily, or like the way they play their instruments. Arguably, it has something to do with the way they sing, which has like an energetic quality to it, that I think was new for many people at the time. But in a lot of ways, you know, they borrowed many of their vocalizations from Black American musicians. You know, in some cases directly, like Little Richard got backstage with the Beatles and taught them to do that woo sound that
Mm-hmm.
they do, that woo falsetto. So yeah, no, like that's kind of what's fascinating to me about that band, is that so much of the fervor around them like doesn't really come from the music. So, but you know,
Yeah, it's idolatry instead of
mm-hmm,
uh, uh, a passion for what they were playing. They were more like there. It was more about the idol of them than it was about the individual music.
for sure.
Um, and so one of the things I really liked about this book was you mixed well-known musicians, names that certainly stand out, with more obscure ones. Talk about how you made the decisions about who to include and who not to include.
Yeah, that was tough because there are so many musicians that definitely could be in this book. And, you know, people every so often will ask, like, why not, you know, this musician? Why this musician and not another? And ultimately, it comes down to my own history as a listener and my own filter. I wrote about a lot of musicians that I've had a historical attachment to, and some that I didn't, and that I got the opportunity to get much better acquainted with over the course of researching and writing this book. But I think I tried to look into the roots of the music that I was seeing right now, like in the past 5 years or so. A lot of music that interests me recently has pretty deep roots in musicians that performed in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Not all of them are necessarily well known, but a lot of them that I write about are fairly influential. And some of them kind of complicate the idea of pop music as a descriptor. Some of these musicians are like definitely not pop. I write about industrial music quite a bit, and Throbbing Gristle is a band that really never sold very many records, that had a fair amount of infamy around them in England, at least in the 70s, but were never like a blockbuster act. But you hear their influence bleeding into bands that did become blockbuster acts, um, to one degree or another, some of which I write about, like Soft Cell, Culture Club, but also Depeche Mode, who, you know, didn't fit completely squarely into this book, mostly because of the way their voices sound, but like I probably could have fit them in if I had more time and more space. Um, but you know, bands that used the same techniques as what was going on in the underground a few years prior, but became much, much more successful, for various reasons. So I guess to answer your question, it's it's mostly my own history, my own attachments, that determined the lens of this book, the frame of this book. Um, and I think if another writer had written the same thing, it could have come out with a completely different set of artists that could have contributed to the same point. And ultimately, it just comes down to like my own attachments and like what I've grown up listening to and grown up loving, and how I kind of plug that into a more historical analysis of why the music I like now sounds the way it does.
So, was there a musician's story that you weren't able to add to the book, but you think is still really important?
Plenty. There are some people that got cut from the book, because they were both underground, experimental, and I couldn't really fit them into a narrative of pop music as such. Artists like Meredith Monk or Diamanda Gallis, women who used their voices in ways that were very provocative and very much, disruptive to the idea of what women can sound like when they sing, but didn't necessarily have the same concrete influence on pop music that some of the other lesser known bands I write about did. There are also musicians who have kind of worked over decades in bubbles that I couldn't quite stitch into the main narrative. Like Jackie Shane is a great example. She was a trans musician who, was essentially out as much as you could be, decades before trans visibility, trans acceptance became a mainstream concern, and kind of lived on the fringes for much of her career. And it's really only in the past 5 years or so that her work has kind of been celebrated and in a new light. And I feel like there's a book to be written just about Jackie Shane, but I couldn't quite sweep her into the overall thrust of the book. So yeah, there's definitely a lot that felt a little bit like odd ends just to the overall narrative, but who are very, very interesting characters in their own right.
So I'm going to kind of build on that. There's so much detail in the book about music styles, music history, and of course the musicians themselves. Can you talk about your research and writing process? How do you go from a large amount of information and distill it down to what's most important?
I feel like my research process for this book was directed more by listening than anything else. For the first few months of ostensibly writing it, I was mostly just playing albums back and like really kind of pouring into the details there, like going over Prince's entire discography and like listening to all the elastic and playful things that his voice did, and trying to find narrative out of that more than anything. And that came before a lot of the reading that I did for this book. So I think really starting with the music is what helped narrow the focus for me. Like going back, listening to artists who might offer some insight into what I'm trying to discover, finding that like emotional connection to a given song or a given album, and trying to figure out like what's going on in me when I'm reacting in this way. Like, why am I lighting up emotionally when, Prince kind of serrates his voice in his falsetto register? And then from there, like doing more historical research, like situating those moments. But I think I really wrote this thing moment by moment, like just picking out these little musical pearls that sucked me in and trying to thread them together into something that resembled a historical narrative. So I guess it's kind of like the opposite of what you were asking. I didn't really start with like a broad scope and then narrow in. It was more like I started with a microscope and then very, very slowly like used bigger and bigger lenses to try to, situate these musical moments and, the history, like in a social history of like queerness across the past 60 years.
Music and art in general have been on the forefront of social change and social issues, including the varied spectrum of gender and what it really means. Do you think it's easier for musicians and artists to address uncomfortable subjects? And if so, why?
Yes, but not necessarily in a literal way. I don't know if it's necessarily easier for a musician to give an interview that, talks very plainly about civil rights than it is for any other kind of celebrity. But I think that music can plant ideas in ways that can be much more subtle and much deeper than other forms of culture. I think that music is narrative, but not strictly narrative. It's kind of dreamlike. It's loose and porous, compared to a lot of like more literal, more narrative based art forms. And it's open to interpretation. And I think a lot of what happens is in music is songs kind of roll through time and accumulate meaning as they go. And listeners play a large part in that as much as artists. I actually think that the history of listening is probably really important, to the idea of music being like a more liberatory art form, because it's so, so open to interpretation. People can take music and apply it to different things. You can make a protest song out of just about anything, or you can just on an individual level, you can take solace in music or see yourself reflected in music, even if you don't necessarily share like an identity position with the person who made it. There's just so much room in it for identification. And that is kind of what I wanted to explore in trying to figure out like why music and gender rebellion were so closely tied, is like what makes music this loose and soft, and why do people respond to it the way they do, which I think is unique among like pretty much all art forms.
Well, and I think about the ability as someone who's performing on stage, right, to put on a persona, to put on a costume or makeup or whatever it is, and to become something. And because we see it as a performance as opposed to maybe you're actually seeing who that person is, right? It makes it a little easier for us to see things, and while we might be a little shocked, not be right as shocked as we might have been. And
totally.
So I as we were talking before, like I'm kind of a child of that punk genre and that wave genre where I'm from a pretty small town here in the state, and most of my friends in high school, the guys included, wore makeup and had black hair. And, I think just kind of playing around fluidly with what did that really mean or didn't mean for us, that the musicians that we were listening to and seeing, even if it wasn't well accepted by our peers, made it seem like it was kind of okay to kind of do to kind of put yourself out on that limb and kind of play around and just see. And I just think that, and the reason why I really found this book fascinating is it really kind of going back and talking about maybe artists that, like Bowie is obvious, right? We kind of all recognize that Bowie was definitely kind of playing around with what everything was through his various phases. But there's a lot of other people that you talk about, like Alice Cooper, that you really wouldn't think about. You wouldn't think about it in the same way. So, I think that's, and do you think that because it's a performance, because it's a stage, especially as venues and concerts get bigger and bigger and people expect more and more, right? People don't expect like the Beatles to stand on the stage and just play some instruments, right? They're there for the spectacle. They're there for the pomp and circumstance. That then also kind of changes the things that we do and the way that has continued to kind of play around with what does it really all mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of plausible deniability that comes with getting on a stage or getting into a recording booth. because it's not quite real life, right? It's a little bit vaulted, it's a little bit haloed. Um, to get on stage and you're immediately lit with light that you wouldn't, be lit with in normal life in your house, or on the street. You are being seen by potentially thousands of people at the same time in the same place. There's a lot of, special presentation around playing music live for sure. But at the same time, it's not quite the same thing as like going to a play or watching a movie where an actor is like very explicitly playing a role, right? There's like that very clear delineation between the actor and the character. In music, there's a little bit of blurriness there, and I think that is part of what allows people to connect to it so deeply. Is that you're never quite sure where the persona ends and like the musician, the real person begins, and sometimes I think it's not even clear to the musicians where that line is and if there even needs to be a line. Um, and I think like performing music, even if it's not in like a huge stadium, venue, uh, I think it is kind of like a heightened state of being. I think singing is kind of like a heightened emotional communication more so than speaking. There's even just like physiologically, there's all kinds of stuff going on with like the vagus nerve and like, the central nervous system that is different when you're singing compared to when you're speaking. Um, so I think there is this like intensity of experience that happens there that makes music performance very well suited to, conjuring up things that can't be spoken plainly.
And I just want to remind everybody who's listening, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. When you kind of start with your song and then you kind of do your research out, how do you then, what is the process that you use to then actually plot that out into a coherent narrative that kind of makes sense on the page, and kind of draws that through line, right? Because that's one of the things that's really well done in this, is that you start kind of in the past and you draw the through line all the way through to kind of what's going on today, how that's influenced by the past, how it's changing, how it's taking the influences from the past and kind of mixing them up and changing them. So that's a lot of information to kind of think through and kind of figure out how you're going to do that through line. So what kind of is your process for that?
Well, I'm glad you think it's coherent. I find that reading what artists say about their own music can be pretty helpful. Looking at, both recent and contemporaneous interviews, to see like what connections artists were making in their own time. And also looking at contemporary reviews, contemporary music criticism can be really helpful. Looking at the connections that critics of the past have drawn between the artists that they were writing about kind of as they were performing and releasing music. But as to, making these connections into the present, a lot of that is pretty subjective, I think, on my part, just like listening for commonalities, in vocal timbre and instrumentation and production styles. I think a lot of music is kind of necessarily very referential. So, like, pop punk from 1998 is not that different from pop punk in 1978. And a lot, even though there's like 20 years of history in there, which is no small amount. But I think like looking at the same structure and like tracking the changes across that time can also be useful. Like what's different between the Buzzcocks and Green Day, like what evolves from that point. Just like, yeah, trying to track those changes just as they hit my ear really, was a large part of it.
So is there somebody that you think we should be listening to right now?
Sure. Plenty I really like the Anjimali record that came out this year. He's an artist based in Boston, which is where I'm from, that put out a record called Give or Taker that is really beautiful. That kind of ties together transness and spirituality in a way that is really lovely. Very earnest, very vulnerable. I think I really like the Backwash album that came out this year. She does like a horrorcore rap combo, which is lovely. There's an artist, there's a vocalist and producer, I think, called Fraxium, who's based in Chicago, and they're kind of one of those artists that puts out music at a really rapid clip, and is really hyper collaborative, and I'm excited to see where they go. My friend Lior Galil wrote a cool profile of them for the Chicago Reader, which I recommend. But yeah, there's lots to keep up with for sure. I think this year I probably even fell behind in my listening habits just because there's so much to pay attention to that's not music.
It's kind of a crazy year.
Yeah.
Life has been crazy for a few months now.
A little bit.
So you kind of started with what you like, what you knew, what you were interested in. In that process, did you find musicians that you were surprised by, that were that either you didn't know about, or that your research led you to learn new things about somebody you did know about?
Sure. You mentioned Alice Cooper earlier, who I was aware of as kind of like an ambient cultural figure, but I didn't realize that he talked so much about like androgyny in interviews in the 70s, that he was, really kind of pushing the line that the difference between like male and female is like predominantly social rather than biological, which is something that, is kind of reiterated to the point of sounding obvious right now, but in 1970 was like pretty shocking. And, he didn't do it to like be a pioneer for like gender rights, but just to be shocking. But it's still interesting. It was interesting how much like these points that are now kind of like used in a civil rights context were used as like a shock rock trope in the 70s. That was fun to find out. I'm trying to think. I mean, even artists that I'd grown up loving, like the Buzzcocks and X-Ray Specs, like just the fact that they talked so explicitly about their own feelings of androgyny while on stage. Like Polly Styrene said that she felt like she didn't have any sex at all when she was performing, and Pete Shelley of the Buzzcocks was a lot more out than I thought he was. Like just the fact that he was wearing like a gay rights pin on his jacket while doing interviews, and was like never kind of came out and said like I'm a bisexual man, but like it was definitely there, is there in the music, and it's like there in his kind of overall affect and the way he like carries himself in public. So I think like a lot of this stuff gets straight washed in contemporary like rock retellings, and it was nice to kind of pull back the curtain on that and see just how much like gender and sexuality rebellion there was pretty much in the open in eras when it wasn't supposed to be allowed.
Yeah, I recently listened to Blondie's autobiography that she did, and it was really interesting for her to talk about New York in the 70s and kind of what that lifestyle that they were living, and kind of how they were the things that they were doing, and the things that they just accepted that that they pulled into their music and their other things. And it's really interesting because the last like week, Blondie videos keep showing up like on my Facebook feed for some totally random thing, and I've watched some of those and I'm like, how did I miss all of this visual? I mean, I was a teenager at the time, so, but all of this visual with all the stuff going on in the videos. It's really fascinating kind of how if we don't have the vocabulary for what that stuff is, how we kind of, we just don't notice it, right? And then later you come back and you go, I certainly realized why I like I said, I'm from a small town in Texas, and they actually tried to ban MTV. Early on when MTV started, the cable company refused to carry it, and there's only one cable company in town, and it was this whole interesting thing. But knowing the mindset of where I'm from, now when I go back and watch those videos, I'm like, oh, that's why, because at the time we were just like, what is wrong with you? That's why they were so worried about it. And of course, there's nothing to be worried about, right? But it was that, mid 80s, very super conservative, and so I one of the things I think is really interesting about music is that's dying, that was a big splash and now is dying away, is the music video, right? The music videos of the 80s, when you watch those, there's so much in them that was going on that at the time you might not have really understood what was happening with all of that. And I just think that it's kind of sad that as a form of expression and part of music now is kind of past its point, right? Because I feel like you might, especially if you're somebody who's from a sheltered background, you might not understand so much what's going on in the music without the visual, right? And especially if you're from somewhere where you're never going to see those people in concert, right? So you're never gonna see the visual. Okay, so we have a question, and this is kind of a long one. So as a cis brown female, I still greatly appreciate the brash and unfeminine staging of their musical work and persona by artists like Kim Gordon, Sonic Youth, Patti Smith, and the Riot Girl punk bands. It seems to have given me space and license to explore my own expressions of physicality in public spaces. Do you listen to or know of, not sure how to pronounce this, Duasale, Duasaleh, and what do you make of their guttural, growly voicings of their lyrics?
I'm not familiar with Duasale, but thank you so much, Tammy, for the recommendation. Oh, sorry. So the name wasn't familiar. Now that I just Googled them, and now that I look at their album cover, it's a very striking album cover, very striking press photos. And this has been on my list of musicians to check out for a long time. And now I have more urgency to get to the record. So thank you, Tammy. I remember seeing them on my Twitter feed and being struck by their styling, just physically and visually. So yeah, they're definitely on the list, and I'm definitely going to check them out. Thank you.
Well, and I think the Riot Girl movement is very interesting, right? That's kind of post my high school age, but I always think of them when that Heath Ledger movie that's supposed to be 10 Things I Hate About You, because the character's really into that kind of Riot Girl punk band movement. And I also recently read a YA book about a teenager, present day, who finds all her mother's Riot Girl stuff in a box in the attic. And then uses that to create a protest movement at her school about how girls are policed with dress codes and those sorts of things. And I think it's really interesting how, especially when you're younger, right? In the moment, you just like the music and you kind of like some of the things that are they're going on around it, but you might not really understand the relationship to how it's kind of shaping you, right? Because, you know, in the same sense that Tammy had, that's what I pulled from wave and punk music, a decade earlier, to allow you to kind of be who you want to be, right? Music kind of gives us that window into our soul that lets us say, this is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that identification can be really intuitive, especially when we're at like a young formative age. Like I remember attaching really strongly to queer men's voices when I was like 12 and not even really knowing that they were queer. Like some of them weren't even like out yet. It was just like something inside me just like reached out and like grabbed onto that and was like, yes, that's the one. That's what I want to become. But like, you know, this was all happening before I had any language for any kind of like gender stuff. It was completely intuitive. It manifested purely in the form of like fandom and obsession and like these weird rituals I set for myself that I like didn't know fully why I was doing. It was just like there's something in me that like needs to get out, and it's getting out in the form of like loving these bands and these artists. So yeah, it's definitely interesting when you get a little bit older and you look back and you kind of like figure out why those identifications happened and what they like said about you, and how they turned you into who you are. Because I think with Riot Girl, and specifically, even though that's such an explicit political movement, so much of it is conveyed just through like affect, and through vocalization. You know, like you don't have to read the politics of Riot Girl. You don't have to like read the zines necessarily to hear, you know, what a band like Bikini Kill or Bratmobile is doing, and kind of get that they're trying to expand what it means to be a woman in a way, to kind of strike out against these ideas of propriety, and decorum that tend to box in femininity. So yeah, I think in a lot of cases the really instant somatic identification hits first, and then you can kind of like zoom out a little bit and look at, you know, what the politics around a given voice really are.
So, are you working on anything new?
Uh, Trying to. It's like very much in fits and starts. I would like to write a book about vocal production, digital vocal production in the 21st century, kind of centering on Britney Spears as a symbol of like the neoliberal predicament that a lot of us are in. But also looking a lot at like Janet Jackson, Destiny's Child, Missy Elliott, just the way that women um, have had their voices change in the past like 20, 30 years, that millennial shift from like analog to digital production, and how that's bled into this millennium where like auto tune and like fractured vocalization and highly compressed vocalization is like very, very common, and how that sort of runs parallel with the digitization of everyday life, with the fact that like most people are on the computer in general, and the both the freeing aspects of that and the limiting aspects of that, the way that it kind of both liberates and constrains us. So it's a very broad topic. But like Britney Spears as herald of the future, I don't know. I'm working on narrowing it down into something resembling a book proposal. I also might be writing like I don't know, an iconography of Michael Stipe, potentially, from REM. But that would be a pretty different project. I mean, they're each kind of like in the same vein of what I'm already doing, but each pretty different. I'm also trying to write fiction lately, which is quite different from
Yes. Change it up. So,
yeah.
do you plot your work, or are you more of a write by the seat of your pants kind of person?
I do most things by the seat of my pants, and writing is no exception. Although to pitch Glitter, I did have to tell them what I thought I was going to do, tell the press what I thought might happen, which was helpful. It is helpful to at least have like a skeleton that you can later, because a lot of it later changed. I split up some chapters, I merged some together, to make it what it is. So I like to work kind of more intuitively and, word by word, line by line. But in order to convince a publisher that you're capable of doing a whole book, you often have to give them an idea of what you intend. So I probably will sketch those out, if I get to the proposal stage.
All right. Well, I think those are all my questions for today, and I don't see that we have any others coming in. Is there anything that you think we should take away from the book that we haven't talked about?
I don't know. Not really. I just hope that it opens some space up for whoever happens to encounter it. That was kind of the goal. I kind of wrote it for, that 15-year-old self that was listening very rabidly to a lot of different music and didn't really know why they, had such strong attachments to certain musicians. And it was kind of an attempt to illuminate some of what was going on in there. So I guess I hope that it can be helpful to others in the ways that it's been helpful to me.
Well, and one of the things that draws me to books is covers, and I have to tell you that I love the cover of this book. It's
Thank
so
you. It's
right.
so
I mean,
it's so pretty, isn't it?
yes, and I love that it shimmers when you move it. I
I
mean,
know. I know. Shout out Amanda Weiss at the University of Texas Press, who designed it. She did a fabulous job, and it was a real pleasure to work with her on
yeah, I
that.
definitely think it's an eye grabber. So, well, I so appreciate you for taking time with us today, and uh, to do this, and we loved having you. And I want to thank everybody who came as well. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can purchase that from the doc, and I'm going to put up their contact information. So the doc is one of our local bookstores here in Fort Worth. If you haven't heard of them before, they are only partially open because of COVID. So I do know that sometimes getting through to them on the phone is a little difficult. So please have patience with them. But you can also order online if you'd like to do that as well. And we also hope that you check out some of our upcoming programs this week, including our next Third Thursday Jazz concert with Rochella Parks, Washington on the 19th, and our offerings next week for Global Entrepreneurship Week. You can get more information on our Facebook page or our website. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a great rest of your Saturday.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank
It's been a pleasure.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.